It's been 16 years since the US-led invasion of Iraq, but is the future of Iraqis looking any brighter? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. 16 years ago this week, the US invaded Iraq, promising to replace Saddam Hussein's oppressive regime with a stable democracy. President Bush's bombing campaign and the war that lasted 9 years resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. Today, the country is still struggling to rebuild. It continues to suffer from deep political and sectarian divisions and widespread corruption. Despite all this, the country's leaders insist that Iraq is in the best state it has been since 2003. Ordinary Iraqis, though, remain skeptical. We caught up with 3 of them at a cafe in central Baghdad.
انه الامريكان اجوا وسقطوا النظام اللي الشعب كان يطمح انه راح يعيش هاي الفتره، بس للاسف انه اللي شفناه بالشارع شفناه قتل، دمار، محاربه بصوره عامه.
بس اكو مداخله مشان تسقيط نظام اذا تتفقون وياي. تسقيط دوله. تسقيط انسان. كان استهداف الانسان.
ايوه انا بالتالي قلت لك انه قدروا، انا قلت لك انه هم هدفين كان، الهدف الاول انه فرض السيطره بصوره عامه، والهدف الثاني انه هو زرع الرعب والدمار.
في يوم من الايام شفت يعني مثلا انا اسكن بمنطقه قريبه على مسرح عمليات يعني. في الحقيقه شفت كان القوات كانت تستهدف حتى الناس يعني بدون اي سبب.
اي طبعا. كبلد اكيد شيء كامل النسف. دولة كاملة انهارت في اسبوعين او في اقل من شهر، ف100% التأثير كان عملاق وكبير، والمشاكل كانت عديدة، بدءا من البطالة لما حلوا كثير من المؤسسات الحكومية والمؤسسات الدولة، وانتهاء بمثل ما ذكرت انا اعتبرها مشكلة الهجرة. كانت مشكلة يعني لما كنت بسوريا 2005 وحتى 4 شوف أعداد العراقيين اللي مقدمين على اليو ان راح تعرف حجم كارثة كانت.
إحصائية بسيطة يعني وزارة الصناعة تقول كانت 2220 معمل يشتغل بالعراق، مصنع بالعراق، الآن هذا العدد وين صار؟ قبل كانت اكو ناس تعمل يعني برغم من وجود نظام، نعم نظام عسكري ديكتاتوري كذا، بس كانت اكو ناس تشتغل، كانت اكو ناس يعني تمشي يعني براحتهم، ما كان هذا الوضع كله، ما كانت اكو فصائل مسلحه، ما كان اكو مسلح، ما كان اكو بطاله، ما كان اكو هجره، كلها ما كانت موجوده. الحقيقه الان نعم صار تغيير، صار تحول، مرحله تحول، صار عندنا يعني هذا النظام هسه الموجود يسمونه النظام وهي الطبقه الحاكمه، بس هي الطبقه الحاكمه تقدر تقول لي ايش قدمت للعراق؟
يعني هي فكره انه انا اقارن حقبتين زمنيتين مختلفتين هي فكره صعبه جدا، وعلى 30 مليون وعلى 19 او 18 منطقه بالبلد. ربما يعني بالفتره قبل 2003 كان اكو نوع من الامان الامني، لكن اكو غياب للامان الاقتصادي، الانسان بدون امن اقتصادي ايضا يعاني. بعد 2003 غاب هذا الامن الامني وصار نوع من الامن الاقتصادي، ارتفاع رواتب.
يعني الولايات المتحده الامريكيه خلقت حاله فوضى، يعني فوضى عارمه بالعراق، يعني انه اولا عدم احترام سلطه القانون، وجود سلطه نيابيه كاذبه، يعني الان السلطه النيابيه شنو يعني الجمعيه الوطنيه
سياسيين
ما هي مجرد يعني حتى القوات الامنيه الموجوده هي تحافظ على امتيازات المنطقه الخضراء، وهذا اللي نعاني منه الحقيقه، هاي جذورها الان.
اللي صارت انه الإصابات اللي خلوا احتزال المناطق، بعض المناطق عن المواطنين، خلوا انه المسؤول والسياسيين طبقه اخرى والمواطن طبقه اخرى، ماكو تواصل، طبقات فرقوا، ماكو تواصل بينهم، عزل. بالتالي ما يعرف المسؤول شنو يريد المواطن والمواطن شنو يريد، يعني بالتالي هنا تاهت.
كل من عايش بوادي.
هو هذا اللي.
So that is the picture from Baghdad. How does the US's first ambassador to Iraq post-Saddam Hussein see the legacy his country left behind? John Negroponte is currently Professor of International Affairs at George Washington University. Ambassador Negroponte, you just heard some Iraqis almost reminiscing about the days of Saddam Hussein. We heard them say before 2003, people worked, people could walk freely, there were no armed groups. Do they have a point? And did you expect that Iraq would still be in this situation so many years after the US-led invasion?
Well, first of all, no matter how one describes it, life under Saddam Hussein was not a bed of roses. Now, those people were interviewed in Baghdad. I suspect you would have gotten different answers in Erbil or in Basra, for example, the Shia community or the Kurdish community. So I think it depends on who you talk to in Iraq. But
this is a random sampling of Iraqis sitting around a coffee table in Baghdad.
But in Baghdad.
And what they're saying is that the United States failed to deliver.
Right. And I think in terms of our legacy, I think history is going to tell. For example, the political reforms that were undertaken, there have been successive democratic elections in that country since 2005 when I was ambassador there. They had their first democratic elections.
Let me ask you about this, Ambassador. You mentioned elections. Now, you were the first U.S. ambassador post-Saddam Hussein, as we mentioned.
Correct.
So you were there in 2005 when the Iraqis held their first post-invasion election. And you said this in an interview. You said, if I have one regret about that period, it is that we were never able to dissuade Sunni politicians from their boycott of those elections. Is that truly the only regret, not the invasion in the first place?
Well, look, I'm not, I would think I was talking about my tenure as ambassador. I was not the policymaker who decided for us to invade Iraq. I think I mentioned to you previously or to others that I had reservations about that. But I'm a professional diplomat. I was given a job to do, which was to be ambassador to that country. I did it to the best of my ability. And the two things we focused on at the time, just so I could be clear about what my role was one, the restoration of some semblance of their armed forces, which had been injudiciously, I would say, dissolved before I got there. And secondly, was the conduct of these first democratic elections, of which I think we were rightfully pleased and proud of those results.
So you mentioned the disbandment of the army, the so-called de-Baathification,
right.
The order that Paul Bremer just, with a stroke of a pen, signed, and overnight 500,000 members of the Iraqi army found themselves on the streets with their guns, with no pensions, with no jobs. But you
and
were
a lot
asked,
of them
you were asked
joining
about
an
this,
insurgency.
Ambassador. They sure did, which gave rise to Al-Qaeda in Iraq and eventually to ISIS. So when you look back, would you say that at least this was a big mistake, if nothing else? The hundreds of thousands of Iraqis killed, the billions lost, the rise of ISIS, the sectarian divide that we just touched on. Would you now say that the de-Baathification was a mistake? Because asked about it in 2006, you said, well, I'm not sure I'd call the de-Baathification itself a mistake.
I think it was a question of at what level you conduct it. Do you just sort of remove the top leadership, or do you remove the entire, everybody who'd ever been a member of the Ba'ath Party? Since even to be a teacher, you had to join the Ba'ath Party. So it's ridiculous. It was like Nazi Germany.
And that's exactly
when we
what happened.
defeated Nazi Germany, we just removed the top level of the Nazi Party, and we allowed a lot of the people who'd been in it at lower levels to continue in their jobs.
So do you call it a mistake now? Because as you say, it wasn't just the army that was disbanded. In fact, a study by Watson Institute at Brown University says that Bremer's order to dismiss senior members of the government, in fact, removed half the intellectual leadership at universities.
I think that's probably correct. And that's,
was it a mistake?
It was. That
was a
part
mistake.
is a mistake. But it would not have been a mistake just to remove the top leadership, which was also done. I think they went too far.
Was it beyond a mistake? Because in addition to being the US's first ambassador in post-Saddam Hussein...
And that was done before I got there, right?
Certainly. But you were also someone who played a very important role at the United Nations as President Bush's ambassador there. You played a role in negotiating the inspections regime, Resolution 1441, which never was allowed the time to take its course.
I gave everything I had to achieve that resolution, and I was very disappointed, I was quite disappointed, that we didn't allow the inspection process time to work. I mean, I would have thought that we would have allowed 6 months to a year to see if that process bore some fruit before we decided to resort to military force.
And why didn't this happen? You said 10 years ago, I thought we could have waited. You said, I thought we were in a bit of a hurry to get into Iraq and we should have given more time to the inspection regime.
Yeah,
why the rush?
I think I've been consistent
why
on that.
Why the rush? What was the goal?
Well, the rush, I think, is that Washington had already... One of the things that came through to me after when it was all over, and when I was out of government, or later on in my government service, it became apparent to me that the planning for the invasion had taken place, was very well advanced, even when we were negotiating those resolutions. I wasn't aware of that up in New York as representative of the United States, the United Nations at that time.
And yet you sat there right behind Colin Powell during his infamous, now widely discredited speech of the United Nations about the alleged WMDs. You sat right behind him. What went through your mind? Because if you don't consider the whole invasion a mistake, surely you must agree with people who consider it a crime of aggression. Clearly the UN Charter was violated because what happened without that second explicit authorization from the United Nations.
Well, I don't know if I'd use exactly the terminology you did, but what I would say is we made the mistake of going into the country without the legitimating imprimatur of a UN Security Council resolution, as we had done in 1990-91 when we went into the first Gulf War, and James Baker devoted an extraordinary amount, our Secretary of State then, an extraordinary amount of effort to get support for a resolution authorizing us to use force.
So what does it make it then? Does it make it illegal at the very least?
Well, there was a coalition of the willing. I don't think we would ever, under our own legal system, come to the conclusion that it was illegal, but it was politically much less sustainable. I mean, you can talk about legality and illegality all you want, but in terms of the political wisdom of doing it, it's just much, much harder to sustain and justify.
But it's extraordinary, though, because besides the legal dimension to this, whether it was legal or not, and Kofi Annan, the UN Secretary General, was asked at one point after the invasion, many years later, was it illegal? He had to say yes, it was, because there was no explicit resolution authorizing the use of force. But back in 2015, you said this, you said, it's amazing. We set up this inspection and we never found anything. Saddam emanated this sort of sensation that he was hiding something. So are you saying then that the United States launched this whole war, this devastating war that had a huge impact not just on Iraq, but on the region, killed thousands, hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, anywhere between...
I think we'd made the decision.
The estimates, Ambassador, anywhere between 500,000 to 2.5 million. Are you saying that this was launched simply on the basis of a feeling, a suspicion?
No, I don't think so. But you'd have to talk to the people who made that decision. I didn't make it.
But there was no evidence.
And as I told you, I think they had made that decision, or almost, they were very close to having made it long before we went to the United Nations. But on the question of the way Saddam behaved, Hans Blix himself, who I worked with very closely because he was in charge of the inspection process, he always told me, you know, John, I just can't understand why Saddam acted so guilty.
Sure, but acting guilty is one thing.
No, but I'm just telling you what he said.
Yes. So just looking ahead briefly, just in the last moments or two that we have, Ambassador, last year you said this, you said no one wants to see us go back into some kind of interventionist mode, and there is serious doubt that would even work. You were speaking about Venezuela, I believe, but is that one of the lessons the United States has learned about not being so politically expedient and getting into an interventionist mode, trying to, quote unquote, democratize nations on the back of a barrel?
Well, look, first of all, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. People sit there and they watch some terrible situation, like everybody in Latin America nowadays, saying, well, why don't the Americans do something? And on the other hand, if you do something and it doesn't work, you're going to be castigated for having done that. But I would say the lesson from my career, which dates all the way back to Vietnam, and our interventions there, and the overthrow of Ngo Dinh Diem and everything else, I would say regime change, be careful what you wish for. I would say that's a major lesson, because you never know whether what comes after it is going to be better, and we have numerous examples of where the situation was worse.
Ambassador John Negroponte, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thank you.
He famously threw his shoes at US President George W. Bush for boasting about the successes of the war on Iraq during a 2008 visit to Baghdad. Muntadhar al-Zaidi, who spent 9 months in prison for the incident, ran for office in Iraq's latest elections last year, promising to fight corruption. While he failed to win a seat in parliament, he's been a vocal critic of Iraqi politicians, blaming them for the lack of progress. We met him in Baghdad recently and asked him why he thinks they failed to deliver.
لا يوجد لدينا ساسة عراقيين، هم فقط سماسرة وفقط هواة سياسة. وأكثر شغلتين أنا أعتقد بالعراق هي لسريعة الربح قليلة التعب والدراسة والاجتهاد هي أن تكون رجل دين أو تكون سياسي. هذا شغلتين أسهل من عدل ماكو، ولذلك تجد كل من هب ودب أصبح رجل دين أو أصبح سياسي. احنا بالعراق لا يوجد لدينا سياسة. السياسي يستطيع أن يسخر دول لصالح دولته، اقتصادات لصالح اقتصاده، ولكن اللي نشوفه العكس، هم فقط مرتزقة دول مجاورة إيران وغير إيران بالعراق، وهم مجرد يعني أدوات عند أمريكا وعند بريطانيا وعند فلان وعند فلان، حتى يعني وكأنه يواليهم على العراق. لا يوجد لدينا سياسة أخي. القرارات الإقليمية هي التي تتحكم بالعراق بنسبة 80%. وأنا أعتقد أنه لو كنا جادين، لو كنا قادرين على النهوض، على اليقظة، على نسيان مصالحنا والاهتمام بمصالح الوطن، نستطيع بعد 10 سنوات على الأقل نتخلص من هذه التهمة الفاسدة. ولكن يوم بعد يوم بعد يوم أجد أنه كل ما قلناه قبل 10 سنوات لم يتحقق الآن.
So is the situation in Iraq as bad as Muntadhar Zaidi thinks? And to what extent do regional powers hold the key to Iraq's future? Joining me for this discussion, Abbas Kadhim, Senior Fellow and Director of the Iraq Initiative at the Atlantic Council, and Michael O'Hanlon, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institution. Abbas Kadhim, Iraqi politicians have been saying that the country is in the best shape it's been in a long time, certainly since 2003. Some of the Iraqis we've been speaking with disagree. You were there recently. You met the Prime Minister, you met the President and other Iraqis. What makes you believe the way you do that Iraq is on the right path?
The sense of security in Iraq is improving tremendously, given the fact that just a couple of years ago, 1/3 of Iraq was occupied by a terrorist group. Many people around the world said this is the end of Iraq as we know it. Iraqis proved resilience almost on personal or self-reliance. They defeated the ISIS and they got back their entire territory. Challenges are still there, a lot of challenges. We have the corruption, we still have many battles to fight. Iraqi politics is divisive. But there are so many signs for hope that I think Iraq is there to stay and Iraq is there to improve.
But can they do it on their own, though? How much help do they need from regional powers, from the United States? Because to rebuild following the fight with ISIS over the last 3 years alone, they're going to need anywhere around $88 billion.
Well, it has to be coming, as the Prime Minister said a few days ago, on last Tuesday, actually, on his press conference. He said, we are not asking for charity. We want the world to stand with us. Because everybody understands that the stability and prosperity of Iraq is good for the region and is good also for the Western interests. So that, definitely Iraq can use all the help it can get.
So stability good for the region and for the West, including the United States, Michael O'Hanlon. Yet the US, which launched this war to begin with, is only pledging $3 billion in credit. I mean, just compare this to the military aid the United States gives Israel every year, $3.8 billion. Given its role in creating this mess to begin with, should the US be doing more to help?
You know, I think the answer is yes to your question, but I'm not sure how far I want to go with the premise. I'm not sure that this should be done out of American guilt. I do think we made a lot of mistakes, but Iraq 2003 was in a horrible place. And it may have looked slightly quieter under Saddam's rule. He was preparing the country for his sons, Uday and Qusay, who might have been even worse. The kind of malnutrition, the kind of violence in the 80s with the Iran-Iraq war, the kind of oppression against political opposition were extreme.
But this again can be pinned down to U.S. policy imposing the sanctions against Iraq after it invaded Kuwait. I mean, that brought it to its knees to begin with.
If you try to ask Americans to do this out of guilt, I think you're going to get a no.
Not out of guilt, but out of responsibility, would you say?
Even out of responsibility. I think it's more about shared interest at this point. I think we have tried for 15 years to build a bond with the Iraqi people. Those of us who have gotten to know them, some people who have worked there have felt that bond. I don't think the United States as a country, as a polity, feels that bond. It's not just the Donald Trump voters. I think most people would say this war, yes, might have been badly handled, but was a mistake from the start. And we've tried, and we've lost a lot of Americans along the way as well. So I think that the whole notion that this should be done out of responsibility, we've tried and used that argument for a while. Now we have to say, what's a practical path going forward that involves modest American investment? But I still think you're right, that it should be at a somewhat higher level than the kinds of loans in the hundreds of millions of dollars that we've been promising so far.
So clearly the United States weighing its options, and there is also a presidential cycle that also determines to a large degree what the United States ends up doing in places like Iraq. But to you, Abbas Kadhim, other regional countries are not waiting. They're trying to vie for influence in the region. We know that Iraq has become a focal point, again, one of many in the region, but a focal point for that rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. The Iranian President Rouhani made a 3-day visit recently. On his heels, the very next day, a huge Saudi delegation showed up. An interesting balancing act, but how is Iraq managing between these two archenemies?
Well, Iraq is trying to compartmentalize its relations on the issues of rivalry, regional and international. They are taking a neutral position. They don't want to be in one camp versus the other, so that's good. But on the other hand, also they are looking at their interests first, and it is the niceties of being an ally for the United States, let's say, or Saudis, are always meeting the brick wall of the fact that they do depend and need Iran for things that there are no alternatives for, such as electricity, such as the trade they have. So it is the Iraqis are living more on reality and on the ground than the demands of foreign policy from Iran's rivals, where they would like to see Iraq to wean itself from dependence on Iran, but no vision of what the alternative is. And I think that's where the breaking point until now, today, is the deadline for the waiver that was given to Iraq for purchasing energy from Iran. It has not been renewed, and also there is no alternative in sight. So
is there an alternative for the Iraqis, because they are heavily dependent on gas imports for their electricity plants from Iran? Are they going to cave into the pressures that the Trump administration is imposing on them, do you think?
No, I don't think they can, for the reason you say, and I think we have to be prepared for that and live with it here. I don't think we need to completely strangle Iran economically to have success with the overall policy of pressure. So countries that truly need some degree of economic relationship with Iran, we're going to have to accept some degree of that. I think if Iran's economy sort of stays flat or contracts a bit, we still have a logic to our strategy. And so we should allow the Iraqis to have a little bit of an option here. They have really no choice. And by the way, as you mentioned, in the broader scheme of things, this is the place. Iraq is the place when the Sunni and Shia worlds can potentially coexist. And heaven knows we need that. So I would welcome Iraq finding some kind of modus vivendi with Iran. Hopefully not too close. Hopefully not under Iranian coercion or threat of assassination or the kind of devious activities that Iran specializes in. But a workable relationship wouldn't be so bad.
And it's interesting because both Saudi Arabia and Iran are obviously trying to carry favor with different factions by investing in different sectors, whether it's education, healthcare, the energy sectors, to try to help Iraq build its infrastructure. But it doesn't stop there, does it? And they're also co-opting a lot of the politicians on either side. We saw that Muqtada al-Sadr, for example, is now, I think it's fair to say, in the Saudi camp. He refused to meet with Rouhani while he was there. And on the other hand, the Iranians have said, we are for all Iraqis. The president and his delegation met with a lot of Sunni tribal leaders while they were there. So what exactly is going on, and who has the upper hand?
This is the nature of the region. People are playing without rules sometimes, or they are bending the rules. But definitely Iran has had always the upper hand because they are well at an advantage. They are in Iraq before anybody else is, and they have stronger allies. And they also seem to be able to maneuver everyone in Iraq, whether it's from the region or beyond.
And an interesting implicit message, I believe, as well, Michael O'Hanlon, to the United States, that we are here to stay, that we are we being the Iranians, are an important player in the region, cementing their cultural, but also more importantly, their economic ties with the Iraqis. To what extent will the United States and President Trump stay on the sidelines, or will he weigh in? Because we heard him recently say that we are going to stay in Iraq and keep our military bases to keep watch on Iran.
Right. Well, first of all, to the extent Iran competes with the Saudis or with us economically and culturally, good. That's the kind of competition we should all want. I don't think we have any reason to doubt our ability to do pretty well in that competition. The historical concern, of course, is that Iran foments violence, and it does it through covert means in Lebanon, in Syria, elsewhere, and certainly in Iraq in the past. So to the extent the Iraqi state is strong enough to hold the Iranians at bay, to make its own decisions, to sometimes have these cross-sectarian dialogues, Sunni tribes with Iranian leaders, or Shia powerful leaders with Saudis. That's all good. That's the kind of competition that we Americans should want and welcome, because it doesn't have to be destructive, and we'll do just fine in that competition. We don't need to be Iraq's only friend or even best friend. We need a stable Iraq where we have some degree of access and influence, and that's good enough.
Michael O'Hanlon, Abbas Kadhim,
Thank you.
Thank you both very much indeed.
Thank you kindly.
So while Iraq finds itself in a delicate balancing act between Iran, Saudi Arabia and the United States, the country is now facing one of its most challenging tests: how to rebuild its shattered economy and manage the competing influences that threaten to undermine its fragile sovereignty and territorial integrity. From me, Rida Fakhri, and the entire team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next week.